Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here for today's explainer session. Grab a seat and get comfortable because we have a truly fantastic subject to dig into today. When we think of historical figures, we usually put them up on this massive pedestal, right? We treat them like dusty characters in a textbook rather than real, breathing people. But today we're diving into the mind of someone who was so much more than just a figure of history. We're looking at a sharp, witty, and honestly, an incredibly relatable 13-year-old girl. We are going to examine the diary of Anne Frank, but not just as a historical document. We're looking at it as a window into the brilliant mind of a teenager who was just trying to navigate life, school, and her own profound need for connection. Let's get right into it. I want to kick off our study session with a question for all of you. Have you ever felt completely alone, even when you're standing in a room completely full of friends? It's a total paradox, isn't it? But honestly, it's a universal human experience, and it is absolutely central to understanding our subject today. Anne Frank felt this exact same way, and it was this profound sense of internal isolation that drove her to do something that would literally touch the entire world. She picked up a pen, and that brings us to this brilliant quote, "Paper has more patience than people." It's one of her most famous lines, and you can totally see why. Anne actually came up with this saying on a day she was feeling a bit down. She was just sitting at home, chin resting in her hands, trying to decide whether she should stay inside or go out. Ultimately, she stayed right where she was, just kind of brooding, and she realized something crucial. That stiff-backed notebook sitting right in front of her, it wouldn't judge her, it wouldn't interrupt her, and it definitely wouldn't get bored. Paper was the patient listener she so desperately needed. So, here's our game plan for today's explainer. First, we'll unpack the idea that paper has more patience. Second, we'll introduce Kitty. Third, we'll review a brief family history. Fourth, we'll dive into the Chatterbox case study. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final joke. All right, section 1. Paper has more patience. Let's keep moving. I really want us to look closely at what exactly motivated Anne to start this diary. It wasn't because she thought she was some great author or that millions of people would eventually read it. Nope. She just needed to get things off her chest. Let's look at a key vocabulary word from our text. Listless. It literally means having no energy or interest. When Anne started writing, she described herself as feeling bored and listless. Picture it, a vibrant, energetic teenager suddenly stripped of all her energy, just sitting there chin in hand. It's a really striking image that sets the entire stage for her writing journey. Moving right along to section 2, introducing Kitty. Now, to really understand this diary, we have to look at the massive, stark contrast between how Anne's life looked to everyone on the outside versus how it actually felt to her on the inside. This is the moment her diary transforms from just a simple notebook into something way more profound. On paper, her external reality was amazing. As she notes herself, she had loving parents, including a dad she called the most adorable she'd ever seen, a 16-year-old sister named Margot, a good home, and about 30 people she could honestly call friends. On the surface, she had everything. But her internal reality, well, it was completely different. Deep down, she felt completely alone in the world. She realized that when she was with her friends, they only ever talked about ordinary, everyday things. They just couldn't seem to get any closer. Which brings us to another key glossary term from our text, confide, meaning to tell personal things to a person that one trusts. Anne realized she was basically unable to confide in the people around her. She didn't want to just jot down a bunch of dry facts like most people do in diaries. She wanted the diary itself to be her friend. So what did she do? She invented a trusted companion. She named this friend Kitty, and Kitty became the ultimate confidant she lacked in her everyday life. Okay, on to section 3, a brief family history. Before she could start spilling all her deepest secrets to Kitty, Anne felt she needed to give her new friend a brief sketch of her life. And it's super important for us to look at these historical facts, too, so we can ground ourselves in the context of her world. The main takeaway here is how incredibly fast her childhood shifted. Anne was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1926, followed by her sister Margot in 1929. By 1933, as things in Germany were taking a dark turn, her family emigrated to Holland. But I really want to draw your attention to 1941 and 1942. Anne writes that her grandmother fell ill, had an operation, and sadly passed away in January 1942. Anne writes this beautiful line about how no one knows how often she thinks of her grandmother and still loves her. In fact, during Anne's birthday celebration in 1942, they lit her grandma's candle alongside the rest to honor her. It's just such a touching, deeply humanizing detail. All right, Let's jump to a specific diary entry, June 20, 1942. Guys, this is so incredibly relatable. The entire class is, as she puts it, quaking in its boots. Why? Because a teacher's meeting is coming up to decide who moves up to the next form and who gets held back. Anne describes the scene just perfectly. Half the class is literally making bets, staking their entire holiday savings on it, pleading, having angry outbursts. It's absolute chaos. Anne herself thinks about a quarter of the class are dummies who absolutely should be kept back. Now, she and her girlfriends aren't too worried about themselves, well, except for one specific subject: math. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the Chatterbox Case Study. This case study is honestly one of the most delightful and revealing parts of the text we're studying today. It really shows us Anne's incredible spirit, her wicked sense of humor, and, yeah, her stubbornness. First, we need to meet her antagonist in this little story. Anne got along pretty well with most of her 9 teachers, but then there was Mr. Keesing. She describes him using a fantastic term from our glossary, an old fogey, basically an old-fashioned person. He taught math, and Mr. Keesing was continually annoyed with Anne for ages for one very, very specific reason. She talked way too much in class. So after giving Anne several strict warnings about her constant chatter, Mr. Keesing decided to assign her a punishment. But it wasn't just your standard detention. Oh no, he assigned her extra homework in the form of an essay. And not just any essay, an essay on the subject of a chatterbox. Anne just jotted the title down, tucked it into her bag, and tried her absolute best to keep quiet. It's fascinating how this punishment escalated into a full-blown battle of wits. Step 1 was the essay on a chatterbox. Then, when she naturally talked her way through the very next lesson, we hit Step 2, an essay on an incorrigible chatterbox. And finally, during the 3rd lesson, Mr. Keesing had officially had enough. He tried to publicly embarrass her with Step 3, assigning an essay entitled "Quack, Quack, Quack," said Mistress Chatterbox. The whole class roared with laughter, and honestly, Anne had to laugh right along with them. Now, to understand how we got all the way to Step 3, we have to look at how Anne handled Step 1. She didn't just write some boring, generic apology. Not at all. She chewed on the tip of her fountain pen and decided to write convincing arguments to prove the absolute necessity of talking. Her defense? She used the concept of inherited traits, qualities one gets from their parents. She wrote 3 whole pages arguing that talking is just a natural student's trait, and while she would try to keep it under control, she could never completely cure herself because, wait for it, her mother talked just as much as she did. It was such a brilliant, cheeky argument that it even got a laugh out of Mr. Keesing. But, as we saw, the talking inevitably continued, leading to that second essay prompt containing the word incorrigible. As our glossary notes, this means something that cannot be corrected, usually a bad quality. Mr. Keesing was essentially calling her a hopeless case. She handed that second essay in, and he had absolutely nothing to complain about for 2 whole lessons. That is, until she finally broke her silence yet again, leading straight to the infamous quack, quack, quack assignment. Which brings us to Section 5, the final joke. Let's see how this plays out. At this point, Anne's back was totally against the wall. Mr. Keesing was trying to play a joke on her with this ridiculous subject in front of the entire class, and she knew she needed to make sure the joke was actually on him. The only problem was she had nearly exhausted her ingenuity, her originality and inventiveness, on the topic of chatterboxes with those first 2 essays. She really needed a fresh approach. Luckily, her friend San, who happened to be great at poetry, offered to help her write the entire essay from beginning to end in verse. Anne literally jumped for joy at the idea. And this brings us to the actual poem she submitted. Guys, it was a beautiful, dark, and hilarious piece of writing. It was all about a mother duck, a father swan, and 3 baby ducklings who were bitten to death by the father purely because they quacked too much. Talk about a direct, pointed parody of Mr. Keesing punishing his students for talking. It was a massive risk submitting something so bold to a strict, old-fashioned teacher. But guess what? It was a total victory for Anne. Mr. Keesing took the joke exactly the right way. Not only did he read the poem aloud to her class, adding his own funny comments along the way, but he actually read it to several other classes as well. Since that day, Anne was officially allowed to talk in class, and she was never, ever assigned extra homework for it again. On the contrary, her act of creative rebellion actually changed her teacher. Mr. Keesing started making jokes himself. How amazing is that? As we wrap up today's explainer session, I want to leave the class with this analytical question drawn straight from our text. Think about this. Does Anne treat her diary kitty as an insider or an outsider? Consider the factual family history she provides early on, but also those incredibly deep secrets she shares later. And further, what does her brilliant, creative clash with Mr. Keesing tell us about her profound need to connect, to be heard, and to express herself in a world where she felt fundamentally alone? I really want you to ponder that long after we finish today. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep asking those great questions.